Hello and welcome to the Wright Around the Murray Festival. My name is Clare Wright and I'm a Professor of History at La Trobe University. And it's my great pleasure this evening to be your host for this evening's event, Past Tense. What's history got to do with it? And we have a dream team of guests here to answer this question. Megan Davis, Tony Birch, Lucy Treloar, Chris Flynn and James Dunk. And they are going to respond to this provocative question, history, what is it good for? I'll introduce our speakers to you further in a moment, but first I'd like to acknowledge the Wiradjuri elders, who are the traditional owners of the unceded Wiradjuri country on which the Wright Around the Murray Festival is based in Albury. I'd also like to acknowledge that Lucy, Tony and I are coming to you from the stolen lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation in what we presently call Melbourne. That Megan and Jamie are beaming in from the stolen lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation in Sydney, and that Chris is enjoying occupancy on Bunurong country in the place that whitefellas call Phillip Island. I pay my respects to all elders, past and present. And if you'd like to know why I haven't said emerging, I'd recommend that you read Professor Megan Davis's latest essay in the Monthly, which is called Reconciliation and the Promise of an Australian Homecoming. Wherever you are zooming in from tonight, the land we are all on now, the land on which we live and work and eat, pray and love, always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd like to welcome viewers who are watching this on Facebook and through YouTube Live. And let me explain how this event is going to run. We're going to hear from each of our speakers for about 10 minutes. And as they address this burning question, history, what is it good for? And following their presentations, we're going to have a panel discussion about some of the ideas and the themes that are raised from the speakers. And then we're going to have audience Q&A. And that's going to be your opportunity to ask the questions that you would like about this prompt or this provocation or anything that the speakers have raised in their presentations. If you want to participate in that, you'll need to submit your questions via the chat function towards the end of the session, and they will get themselves to me. All right, let's not beat around the bush. Let's go straight to our first speaker, who is Professor Megan Davis, and I'm going to introduce her now. Megan is a cobble woman from Queensland, a human rights lawyer and a constitutional lawyer, and one of those rare and wonderful scholars who works at the interface of academia and activism. Professor Davis is currently the Pro-Vice-Chancellor of Indigenous at UNSW and Professor at Law at the UNSW Law School. Megan currently serves as a United Nations expert with the UN Human Rights Council's expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous people based at the UN in Geneva. She has been the leading constitutional lawyer working on Indigenous constitutional reform for the Referendum Council since 2011. She was appointed in 2015 by the Prime Minister to the Referendum Council, eventually leading to that 4-day First Nations National Constitutional Convention that was held at Uluru in May 2017. Indeed, Megan was the first person who gave the Uluru Statement its first public hearing at that historic event. With Marsha Langton, she's the editor of the book It's Our Country, Indigenous Arguments for Meaningful Constitutional Recognition and Reform, and her essays have been widely published in Griffith Review, The Monthly, and in many scholarly journals. Meg, welcome.
Thank you, Claire. So this is a very interesting kind of topic to contemplate in the context of my work as a constitutional lawyer. History, what is it good for? I'll speak to this question insofar as the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And I say that because we are in the year 2020 and we are now looking back on 10 years of a recognition decade 10 years, and those past 10 years are now history. The recognition decade, though, emerged out of a reconciliation decade, a decade not just defined by reconciliation, but also by the history wars. The history wars, a really disruptive and damaging period of Australian history for many Aboriginal people who watched from the sidelines, in some ways like spectators for many of us who aren't professionals in that space, just watching the history wars like a kind of Olympian table tennis game. Everything about us without us. And certainly from history to law and policy, we haven't always been at the table. We mostly haven't been at the table. So if I look at what occurred in 2017, 3 years ago in May, where First Nations gathered at Uluru with the Anangu people, the Anangu elders there, from all corners of the southern sky to issue the Uluru Statement from the Heart to the Australian people, a never-before consensus, an unprecedented process by which Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, for the first time, had been asked to participate in constitution building or constitution making. We weren't asked in the 1890s, and we weren't asked up until 2017, what kind of recognition would you like in the Australian Constitution? And the answer to that is really, I think, central to history. What is it good for? Because in many ways, as the leading constitutional lawyer in that process, history played three roles, really. The first was that it settled a lot of concerns that people had about constitutional recognition. It, in some ways, shined a light on our past. Secondly, it anchored the process. It anchored these law reforms in a history that was understandable to us. And thirdly, it set out a pathway forward for this law reform. And I want to refer to those three, I think, points in my comments. The first that I would say is that the Referendum Council's work, the Referendum Council having been set up by Malcolm Turnbull in 2015, their work was to retrofit in the recognition decade a consultation process with First Nations peoples about what form of recognition they would like in the Constitution. Yes, it is true, we had gone all the way through this recognition decade without actually asking the to be recognised what form of recognition they would like. That was my job, Arnie Pat's job, Noel Pearson's job, all of them, lots of members of the Referendum Council, was to go out to communities and ask people what they wanted. But we didn't want to do a tick and flick consultation process. We ran a deliberative constitutional First Nations dialogue that allowed our people to be in control of that process. But the number one thing, I think, that allowed us to move on in the process at each of the dialogues, so that our people ended up coming up with a really clever constitutional reform that not a single constitutional lawyer had come up with prior to the dialogue. So prior to 2017, not a single constitutional expert had come up with this very clever idea, was history. We went to communities, to 13 regions. We ran this deliberative dialogue, and the first question people asked was, what about Australian history? And that is a really important question. They said, where are we in Australian history? Where are our stories? Why don't Australians want to know what happened to us? Why don't Australians know about the protection era or compulsory racial segregation? Why don't Australians talk about the frontier wars? Why don't Australians want to know about what happened to us during assimilation? History was at the front and centre of this process. So we had to adjust the actual process of the constitutional dialogue to build in a day of conversation and discussion and debate about Australian history. And then after that first day, we then moved on to the legal reforms. So history was really important because it grounded this process. We were able to go back over 100 years of our people's advocacy for constitutional recognition. And prior to this process, the recognised movement and all of the activity around constitutional recognition implied that the form would be symbolism, that the kind of recognition we were pursuing would cede our sovereignty. What history enabled us to do was to show our people that actually we've been calling for forms of constitutional recognition for a very long time, and that nothing can cede our sovereignty. The second point I wanted to make was around how it anchored this law reform process, because of course truth, history, became the third component of this law reform agenda. At the end of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, there were 3 reforms that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people said would be a meaningful form of constitutional recognition: a voice, treaty, and truth. So a constitutionally enshrined voice to the Parliament that would require a referendum, a Makarrata Commission, so a commission that could supervise agreement making or what they call treaty making across the Federation. And finally, truth-telling. So a process in Australia of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders and Australians coming to terms with the past. Now, in those dialogues, we gave very little away about what people said truth-telling might look like. And post-Uluru, it's been filled with all sorts of assumptions about what it might look like, including a Truth and Reconciliation Commission like South Africa. But that's simply not the case, and it couldn't be further from the truth. That is simply not how people see truth-telling rolling out in Australia. And in fact, it's a good lesson, I think, for historians to not preempt what it was that people wanted, but to listen and hear what it is that they're saying about their role in Australian history and what truth-telling means for First Nations peoples on a First Nation to nation basis. But history very much anchored this reform: voice, treaty, and truth. And finally, history paved the way forward. If we look back now and we look forward and we see all of the kinds of challenges and opportunities that we have to get this Uluru Statement from the Heart, the constitutional reform across the line, it is history guiding the way. It is not just the last 10 years of a recognition decade. It's also the reconciliation decade. What we can see, though, is a pattern of governments using truth-telling and history as a way of avoiding substantive concrete reform. And that is why truth is at the end of the sequence: voice, treaty, truth. We're saying, don't kick the can down in the road to set up a process that allows you to avoid the fundamental issue that we are asking for, and that is some kind of constitutional power, some kind of redistribution of power in the Constitution that all Australians sign off on, that gives us a voice. And that's my final point as I come to my 10 minutes. The next phase, the next 10 years, is a challenge to historians. When our people spoke about history and Australian history in the dialogues, they were challenging the way in which history is told, the way in which they're excluded from those stories of Australian history. They were very critical of Australian history and Australian historians. And so I think that that's a really important message for history. What is it good for? Because it will certainly set the way forward for us as we move forward the very complex politics that will arise as we bring this home to a referendum. And I'll just end my comments there, right on 10 minutes. That's how good I am.
There's no doubt about it, Megan. You are very good. Okay, I have so many questions that I would like to jump in there with, but that's not how this is proceeding. We're going to move straight into the next speaker, who is Dr. James Dunk. Jamie is an historian who writes about mental illness and mental health, planetary illness and planetary health. And that lovely line is lifted straight from Jamie's website. I haven't made that up myself. Jamie's first book, based on his University of Sydney doctoral thesis, is Bedlam at Botany Bay, which was shortlisted for the 2020 Queensland Literary Awards, the Kay Daniels Award, and the Ernst Scott Prize, which are both presented by the Australian Historical Association. Just last week, wait for it, Bedlam at Botany Bay won the Australian History Prize at the New South Wales Premier's History Awards. Congratulations, Jamie. It's a absolutely great achievement. Of the book, the judges said, combining meticulous research and compelling writing, James Dunk's Bedlam at Botany Bay offers readers a strikingly original rereading of early colonial Australia. Beautifully crafted and deeply empathetic, this is a book with genuine literary and scholarly merit. It makes a significant and invigorating impact on the field of Australian history and deserves to be read and discussed for many years to come. And I guarantee you it will be. Jamie is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Sydney, working on histories of planetary health, depth psychology, and human ecology. And that's quite the research trifecta. Jamie, welcome.
Thanks very much, Claire. Well, what is history good for? The formulation is normally rhetorical. The answer is normally nothing. Some people see history as a stuffy, pretentious, wrong-headed old discipline with its head stuck in the 19th century. See history as tired and worn and dismally wedded to the past. After I spoke at an interdisciplinary workshop, a well-meaning young epidemiologist came up and said to me, "This is really important what you're doing, but could we maybe call it something else? History just sounds so dull." Last year, when I saw the theme for this History Week, I thought that it might be a mistake. It might make us seem as though we've fallen out of step in a fast-moving, forgetful world. What is history good for? But then an already tired old meme 2020 happened. And as we've lurched from one crisis to another, people appear to have been reading and watching and listening to history at every turn. Histories of fire and climate change, histories of slavery and structural inequality, and some extremely well-timed histories of infectious disease. Why is this? Perhaps because history is an anchor in changing times, as Libby Robin has written. We seem to have woken in a storm, surrounded by jutting rocks and shoals, the ocean tearing itself apart around us. As we flail, some of us may yearn for what felt like long stretches of smooth sailing, with the seabed of cumulative human experience far below and behind us. And now, in shock, we find ourselves hard up amidst the jagged and ungainly outcrops of everything that we have been and said and done, and the things that have been done to us. In these waters, history is an anchor, a way of knowing where we are, holding ourselves together. History is also a measure. Many have found it necessary to gauge whether everything that's happening has happened before, to know that other eyes have looked out over evil vistas and seen worlds sinking and burning. Others are at pains to know that none of this has ever happened before, that these times are unprecedented. History is also a teacher and a textbook. It holds a wealth of lessons in which cause and effect have been wrapped in story, making narratives that lean towards a moral. So we might ask, what lessons are there for us in the assault upon the world by influenza that occurred eerily almost a round century ago? What did we learn about the interaction of viral organisms, hosts, and vectors? About the implications of sickness and death multiplied a millionfold? About decision-making and public communications under the burden of a pandemic? These months of crisis have reminded us that history is many things to many people. I'd like to suggest another role, that of solace. History draws us into other times and places that humans have known and lived. It reminds us we are not alone, far from alone, in adversity. It humbles us with the courage and honesty and goodness of other times, and leaves us on reflection with the knowledge that we are survivors. I don't mean this glibly. Our species have survived the biological alterations of this planet. which may provide Goldilocks conditions in a general sense, but has nevertheless pruned and shaped its species in exacting interventions. And this species has survived its own brutality and cruelty. Written into this world, on this planet, history offers solace to those staring into the abyss. Historical facts may yield anchors and yardsticks and lessons, but if the past is to offer any solace, it must come alive. If history is to provide any sort of companion, it must be woven together with imagination and interpretive creativity. This, of course, opens it up to imaginative interpretive difference and arguments, and to license that pulls a narrative farther and farther away from what actually happened, so that human experience becomes so much material to be picked up and reworked. And here novelists, poets, filmmakers, choreographers, musicians, all those who travel more lightly and work more freely with this material will step in and create their art, and they will be received by others as the things of beauty and truth that they are. The past is, after all, the great storeroom or warehouse or playground from which all our stories skip and march, shout and sing, slip and stumble forth. Or as Tom Griffiths writes in The Art of Time Travel, the past is all we have. The past, the full sum of human experience, is all we have on which to base our hopes and plans, and from which to draw our conversations, ideas, and stories. From this warehouse arrive the inimitable characters that populate the works of Dickens and Eliot and Austen, characters who remain with us and may even help us make sense of our own world. And there are the more searching, more tortuous, subterranean explorations of, say, Fyodor Dostoevsky, Raskolnikov stalking around St. Petersburg, Ivan growing paler and paler, Stavrogan and Vergovensky and Kirillov talking into the night, thinking the greatest and most awful thoughts of their generation. Or if you like the truths of Marilyn Robinson, written with such disarming structure and syntax as she fixes Jack and Lila within a harrowing, overflowing drama of ordinary love and faith. These characters are woven from the banks of human experience in literature that demonstrates spiritual, psychological, and anthropological brilliance. And these novels provide a coherence and a narrative closure which historians can only look at with envy. As Inga Clendinnen writes in Tiger's Eye, only fiction can redress the existential ambiguities which stalk the real world. Which makes us wonder, why is it that people continue to look to history? For facts and raw material, yes, but I think it's also something that runs much deeper. I think we need to know that someone was, that something was said, that someone did this or that in the real ambiguous world. What that or this is may not actually signify, but this and not some other, exactly this in this way. Like Sam, the sweet pathological liar played by Natalie Portman in Garden State, when she feels she's losing her footing, she consciously does something that has never been done before and can never be repeated, in order to situate herself in historical time. She insists on and draws solace from her own particularity. I think we want to insist upon this particularity together, that we want other particulars of the real world, not only our own. And this only comes from a delicate arrangement between historians and archives. Historians know and often celebrate the strange joy of archival work. Buried underground, normally, hunched over a table, opening up a box or a folder and tying strings to find within something particular. A letter, a judgment, a casebook, a requisition, a word scribbled in a margin, an underline, an exclamation mark, maybe 2 exclamation marks. Marks scratched into this piece of paper by a pen expressing desire or consternation or formulating some idea, something particular and not general, particular and not repeated or repeatable. An artifact. As we open and uncover and see, we begin an act of communion with the particular, the actual. It's not, of course, a direct union. There's nothing supernatural in that sense, but there is something that defies the chemistry of memory and the physics of time to become somehow magical. A communion, mediated only by the distance between the imaginations at either end of those words and marks. Like other historians, when I write, I try to share those moments of communion by drawing attention to the particular, the detail, dwelling on word choice, intonation, dress, lighting, the flick of the hair, the cocking of a pistol, the straining of canvas in a storm. And by careful reconstruction and interpretation, I work to reveal the meaning and significance of those details, drawing on my own knowledge as well as our cumulative understanding of the period and place, the texture of personalities and landscapes, but also the broader strokes of industrial conditions and social categories and political systems. Whatever wider structures and patterns illuminate those particulars. This is difficult and time-consuming work, and many simply cannot or will not do it. It's sometimes not immediately obvious whether that work has been done, because while some words seem to carry the ring of truth, the actuality, the truthfulness of a historical narrative is only established by a delicate contract between writer and reader. A moral contract, as Clendenin had it, by which historians commit to not making things up, to the faithful representation of what they have found in the archives. Novels present their truth. The work of history is to find and articulate those truths embedded in archives and other less formal repositories. But its singular, indispensable, and very good vocation is to draw us into the solace of a strange, quiet communion of actual beings in the actual, real, ambiguous world. A communion that stretches throughout time and place, just as far as our imaginations will allow. Thank you.
Yep, well, now I remember why I do what I do. Thank you, Jamie. But our next speaker is one of those people who Jamie's just suggested historians are envious of, a novelist. Lucy Treloar is an author and creative writing teacher. She was born in Malaysia and educated in England, Sweden, and Melbourne. Her first novel, Salt Creek, which was published in 2015, is set in colonial South Australia, and it won the Indie Award for Best Debut, the Arbia Matt Ritchell Award, and the Dobby Award, and it was shortlisted for prizes including the Miles Franklin Literary Award and the UK's Walter Scott Prize. Lucy's short fiction has been published in Sleepers, Overland, Seizure, and Best Australian Short Stories, and her non-fiction in newspapers and magazines including The Age, the Sydney Morning Herald, Meanjin, and Womankind. Her latest novel is Wolf Island, set on the east coast of America, and it was shortlisted for both the 2020 New South Wales Premier's Literary Award for Fiction and the Arbia Literary Fiction Book of the Year. Wolf Island has been described by Thomas Keneally as an important literary fable of our period of history, in which a fraught world threatens all of us with flight, exile, and bewilderment. Lucy is currently completing a PhD by creative practice at La Trobe University with an exegesis on climate fiction and the limits of moral didacticism. Welcome, Lucy.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be here. I'm going to be talking a little bit about conversation and how I think history relates to conversation and the importance of that. And I've come to see that history gathers people in a kind of conversation, but it's taken me a while to work that out and to work out even why that matters. It took writing history to learn that and to understand the registers in which those conversations take place. So I'm going to tease out a little ways I see that happening and why I think it's important. And because I'm a person who thinks in terms of concrete examples rather than abstractions, I'm going to ground my experience a little bit in my own writing of history. So first of all, I see it as a kind of the first of these conversations as between past and present. I studied history at school, didn't we all? The history we learned lay flat on the page. To me, it was dead, littered with numbers, disconnected from the present. It was just information. It might as well have been exhumed from a grave. I did have history in my life, though, all that time without ever recognising it as such. My parents are both from South Australia, but we lived in Melbourne and drove backwards and forwards every summer. I had fragments of family stories that my families passed down, that my parents and family passed down, and they all began at the time every branch of the family tree arrived in South Australia from the 1830s to the 1850s. So a few years ago when I wrote the historical fiction Salt Creek, it was very loosely based on the time my ancestors spent in the Coorong region of South Australia in the 1850s. The then province of South Australia, so-called, had subdivided and leased huge tracts of land that the Ngarrindjeri people had been the traditional owners of for millennia upon millennia. My forebears, who had been in South Australia for about 15 years at this time, took a lease and stole this land. Salt Creek is a personal reckoning in some ways. It's filled with conversations and comments to me, with my family's fragmentary oral history, with my great-great-great-great-grandfather, with the anthropologist and historian Inga Clendenin, and with Kate Grenville, and weirdly, with Tony Abbott. The first of these is with the book's context. The book is in part a response to discussions around apologies to the stolen generations and the Sorry Day marches of earlier this millennium. And it was when I started probing surviving relatives about the stories that were passed down. A fundamental contradiction lay at their heart. My great-great-grandmother was said to have run wild with the local Aboriginals, but the land her grandfather leased, on which he employed Ngarrindjeri people, was always said by family to have been empty when they moved there. Clear problem with this set of stories. When I began researching and writing, I was essentially asking my family, why have we been misrepresenting our family history for 170 years? And I was asking my distant ancestor, what were you thinking? What did you tell yourselves that you were doing? And while I was doing all that research, I was looking for the answers to those questions. So the project for me was about uncovering and facing the truth. Sometimes the author is in a conversation with their own actions and beliefs, wondering what they would have done themselves. Unless we name the damage done and the reasons given for it, we're doomed to repeat it, aren't we? History as a warning, history as a lesson. I might have expected the past to suggest views like everyone was doing the same, the land was empty. But I came across a remark from my ancestor to a parliamentary inquiry into the state of health of the Aboriginal people of South Australia, in which he said, no good has ever come to Aboriginals from contact with Europeans. And it was such a kind of revelation to me that he knew the damage he had caused, and he and other Europeans, and had proceeded anyway. Actions don't always follow beliefs. I guess we all see that around us. I began to reconsider some of his documented actions as a response to his personal shame. If he could appear today, he might ask, do you really think you're so much better? We only have to look at Rio Tinto's destruction of Juukan Gorge in Western Australia, or the sacred Jabwarung trees near Ararat in Victoria, whose felling for a highway extension has been approved. The significance of these places is well documented. No one can claim ignorance, and yet these things go ahead. This doesn't mean that history is pointless, though, in my view. Without the understanding of and feeling for the significance of those places, pressure can't be applied. My conversation is with my family's past, present, and future. It's a multi-generational, ongoing conversation that I have with the family history as it was passed down to me and as I pass it on to my children. But the history is mutable. It's a dynamic one as a result of these various conversations. The past has been altered by the present and the present by the past. But the creation of a work of history isn't simply a conversation between past and present. Kate Grenville has described history as in some ways a Trojan horse. I agree. For me, it's a conversation with contemporary life and it's reckoning with the past. So in part, this is the layers of Salt Creek for me. It's me saying to Kate Grenville, interesting, here's how things unfolded on the Coorong in, my research reckoning. And historical fiction is also an expression of the contemporary writer using the past to speak to the present. I wrote about oppression of various sorts in the past, covertly addressing its ongoing existence. Rage at Tony Abbott, who at the time of writing was busy articulating his misogyny, propelled quite a bit of that book. Not so much a conversation as a loud, long shout. To the great Australian anthropologist Inga Clendenin, I'm saying, I think there's a place for historical fiction. I think it's so much more than entertainment. Not that there's anything wrong with entertainment. I think it ripples into other people's family conversation and into their beliefs and understandings. The historian Laurel Thatcher Ulrich once described history as a conversation and sometimes a shouting match between present and past, though often the voices we most want to hear are barely audible. Here, I'd like to mention the quieter conversations that history can give rise to. That is, the conversations that happen outside texts, sometimes related to them, and oral histories. Various conversations open up outside a book's publication, at talks or writers' festivals, through direct communication, emails, letters, and messages. And for me, they're among the most rewarding and enriching. People tell me fragments from their own family histories, and I feel them connecting us in some way, helping to form this web between people. I think they're looking for somewhere they can be part of a larger conversation, including with authors or with works they've connected to. People are sometimes diffident or even apologetic about their stories, but the stories are always riveting, intensely moving, highly polished, beloved stories, and never, as far as I know, represented in historical texts. Sometimes I feel and hear the ripple effect of broadening conversations as people ask their own questions of their pasts, including me in their family conversations. Write it down, I say, make sure it isn't lost. Sometimes I have the feeling that a reader has met me at the end of a long argument. At Adelaide Writers' Week this year, a woman in town from the country marched up to me and said ferociously, "I just want you to know that you changed my mind." I wasn't really sure that that was a good thing. But so for me, history isn't alive. It gives context for conversations to occur, for the web of what it is to be human to be maintained, for the possibility of an exchange of ideas and changes of views to be present, if not always acted upon. Conversations across time keep breathing life into it, enriching us and our understandings. The past making us anew now, and the present making the past come to life. What were you doing? What were you thinking? I ask again and again in my writing. We were you, the past says. Once we were you.
Thank you so much, Lucy. Our next speaker tonight is Chris Flynn, also a novelist, an editor and a critic. Chris is the author of The Glass Kingdom and A Tiger in Eden, which was shortlisted for the Commonwealth Book Prize. His fiction and non-fiction have appeared in The Age, The Australian, Griffith Review, Meanjin, Australian Book Review, The Saturday Paper, Smith Journal, The Big Issue, Monster Children, McSweeney's, and many other publications. He's nothing if not prolific. Chris has conducted interviews for the Paris Review and is a regular presenter at literary festivals across Australia, in person and now also virtually. His latest novel is Mammoth, which is the story of how the skull of a Tyrannosaurus bataar, the fossilised bones of a dire wolf, a pterodactyl, a prehistoric penguin, the severed hand of an Egyptian mummy, and a 13,000-year-old extinct American mastodon came to be on sale at a natural history auction in New York in 2007. Fun fact, Chris lives next to a penguin sanctuary, and something else that most people haven't figured out about him, he's Irish. Welcome, Chris.
Oh, hello, Claire. How did you work that out? Look, history, what is it good for, right? The temptation to burst into a very bad alternate rendition of the 1970 Motown song War is overwhelming here for me. I want to say history, huh, yeah. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. Which, of course, as James said earlier, is not true. And as Lucy just said, we grow up being told how important history is as a teaching tool. We are supposed to look back at the past, analyze the mistakes that were made, and learn from them. History is supposed to show us how to live better today and how to improve tomorrow. At least that's the theory, isn't it? The reality is quite different. We tend to make the same mistakes over and over ad infinitum. We struggle with change. We profess nostalgia for how things used to be, and thus we prevent ourselves from improving our lot in life. We like to think of ourselves as separate to history, as if the time we're living in now won't become history tomorrow. So I've got a bit of a head scratcher for you all to think about. What if history doesn't exist? And by that, I mean, what if the past, the present, and the future are the same, and we have equal access to all of it? If that sounds a bit like time travel, it's not a million miles away from what I'm getting at. I'm talking about the idea of us being here in the present and reaching back into the past, literally, to not simply examine the errors that we as a species may have made, but to correct them. And in doing so, we solve present-day problems and we change our future, not just for ourselves, our selfish, irrational humans, but for all the species that we share the planet with. As it turns out, the past is not actually dead at all. It's still alive, or at least it will be soon, because we are bringing it back. So what I'm talking about here is my latest book, Mammoth, which Claire kindly just gave a little praise of, which makes it sound insane. But one of the things that I talk about in the book is cloning. The book, I was been lucky enough to have a praise quote from Dr. George Church, who is the world's leading synthetic biologist, and he's professor of genetics at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Church is also in charge of the Harvard Woolly Mammoth Revival Team, whose remit is to resurrect extinct mastodons. Now, why would anyone want to devote resources into bringing back a species that disappeared from the Earth 10, 12,000 years ago? We can't even take care of the species that we have here now. Well, they're doing it not just because they can, although the scientific community is sometimes guilty of bypassing moral concerns surrounding that, but because we actually need them back. We need the mammoth again. They're going to help us solve a couple of our problems. See, there used to be tens of millions of mammoth. The great herds roamed the steppe, which was a huge landmass that encircled the northern region of the globe. Their existence meant the climate was fairly stable. It was cold, it was dry. If it did snow, the mammoths compacted it, stomped it down, and then they kept the ground cold and hard. Then, of course, we turned up, our ancestors turned up. We had evolved past Neanderthals by that stage into much more sophisticated beings, capable of rational thought and competent with a range of tools. Still lacking in foresight, though. Over the space of a few thousand years, we hunted the mammoth herds to extinction. We killed them, we skinned them, we ate them. They were essentially an ambulatory smorgasbord that helped our forebears flourish. Except then it started to get hot. No more mammoths meant the ground heated up and the ice began to melt. Forests grew and it started to rain quite a lot. So our presence altered the climate, making it much more pleasant for us for a while. Now, of course, we've gone too far the other way, and we really need to cool the planet down before it gets so hot it becomes unbearable for our descendants to live here. Now, that's easier said than done, of course. It's a bit of a tall order. It requires us to change the fabric of society. The attitudes and consumption habits of billions of people must be dramatically altered for that to happen, which means we need governments and business to be on board. Currently, they're mostly not, which has a lot of us worried. It's feasible, I guess, that we will make the necessary societal changes eventually, but we all know this isn't going to happen overnight, and possibly not even within our lifetimes. However, a revenant from the past could buy us some time. There are currently laboratories in Harvard and Seoul and Shenzhen, and they are de-extincting species that could help us. Some of the creatures that they're de-extincting are the passenger pigeon, the mammoth itself, some prehistoric horses, the Tasmanian tiger. The handy thing about history, you see, is that it lingers. Archaeologists, paleontologists, they keep history alive, and just as well. Because in 2006, there was an intact 10,000-year-old mammoth carcass thawed out of the Siberian ice. You can see it on a documentary called Extinction 2.0, I think it's called. And when they thawed it out, it stank because there was still rotting meat on the bones. And it began to bleed as soon as it was exposed to the air, which meant that the scientists present were able to collect blood samples. In other words, living DNA. They also ate some of the raw meat just so they could say they were the first men in 10 millennia to do so. How typical. It tasted gamey, apparently. They probably should have analyzed it for ancient parasites first, but there were cameras present and someone dared them, so science. So armed with this viable DNA sample, efforts are now at quite an advanced stage of recreating the mammoth in the lab. The idea is to have the first generation of mammoth raised by African elephants. They're very similar creatures, 99.95% the same. You just need to tweak that DNA a little bit to give them a fur coat and some slightly larger tusks. So the initial ones we birthed in the lab, and then they will be raised by African elephants, and then eventually a herd will get big enough that they can breed naturally. Where they're going to live, there's already been rewilded areas of Siberia set aside for the new herds, run by a Russian scientist, Dr. Sergei Zimov, and his son. It's called Pleistocene Park. So this sounds insane, I know, but one day in our lifetime, maybe even fairly soon, they're saying possibly within the next couple of years, we're going to see baby mammoth on the news. And once they grow up, mammoths will stomp around Siberia once more, just as they used to. They'll compact the snow and they will cool the earth. The hope is that their presence will arrest the melting of the permafrost and thus buy us some time in order to get our act in order. It's a strange solution, isn't it, to think of the past solving a serious problem of today and fixing the future, altering it to deviate from the path that we're all worried so much that it's going to take. It's time travel, you know. When we were kids, we imagine going back in time. I used to always do that, back through history to see what it was really like. We wonder how it would have been to live in the Middle Ages or ancient Greece or the Pleistocene. How strange and unsettling to think that we are on the verge of inventing a form of time travel by reaching back into the past and using science to resurrect long dead creatures that once walked the earth. You have to wonder if history is better off where it is, and if in our arrogant cleverness, we're not making yet another in a long line of terrible mistakes. I guess perhaps these newly cloned animals will be able to tell us, because like it or not, they're coming from out of our past. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And indeed, in your novel Mammoth, the animals do tell us what they've got to say. Our next and final speaker is Professor Tony Birch. And Tony is a novelist, a short story writer, a curator, a poet, an activist, and indeed an historian. Tony has been so prolific and wide-ranging in his creative practice that few actually remember that he wrote his prize-winning PhD in history at the University of Melbourne. It was about how the inner city suburb of Fitzroy was constructed as Melbourne's worst suburb. Tony's short story collections, Shadowboxing and Father's Day, are regulars on high school reading lists. In 2017, Tony was awarded the Patrick White Literary Award, an annual prize given to a writer who has been highly creative over a long period of time, but has not necessarily received the recognition that they deserve. Tony's been shortlisted for too many awards for me to mention, and won many of them as well, but I just want to flag his latest novel, The White Girl, which won the 2020 New South Wales Premier's Prize for Indigenous Writing and was shortlisted for the Miles Franklin Award. And it is currently, and this is fairly breaking news, being adapted for the screen. Tony has recently retired as a research scholar at the Mundani Bullock Centre at Victoria University, where he's led several important projects on climate justice. And Tony is also a proud father of 5 and grandfather of 2, making his own history. Welcome, Tony.
Thank you very much, Claire. Thank you for inviting me, and I want to say, firstly, thank you to the other speakers for the terrific presentations. What I want to talk about, in fact, is something quite specific in relationship to what we might call a national history project in Australia, and that is the impact of living in a country which is a colonial society, in which a society which is built on the theft of Aboriginal land and the desecration of Aboriginal history and culture. It's always therefore going to be heavily contested. When you imagine that you're writing a history of terra nullius, in other words, when you're trying to create a mythology or a fiction, that you're occupying a so-called no man's land or a land that doesn't have occupation, you are engaging in fiction from the outset of your stepping foot on that country. So if we look at the very early period of invasion of First Nations land in Australia, there are certain mythologies, fictions, and historical lies which make that occupation necessary and legally valid within a European sense. So it can take the form of the fictions that are produced by explorers, so that if you read the diaries of major explorers like Sir Thomas Mitchell, who was the chief surveyor in the colony of New South Wales in the 1830s, if you read his 3-volume supposed history of what is called Australia Felix, repeatedly, that while he's on that journey and entering diary notes, he doesn't state that there are no Aboriginal people present, because that would be an out-and-out fabrication. But clearly, to uphold the mythology of terra nullius, he writes about people in a way that doesn't give a sense of the sophistication of the Aboriginal story of place, or the deep culture and historical relevance to a deep time history between Aboriginal people and the country that is being nurtured. So it can occur that way. It occurs in ways such as when you think about the ferocity of the violence that First Nations people face with invasion of country. A second form of fiction, and in this case a very insidious and violent fiction, is the fiction of the description of people, and again the denigration of people's history and culture. And to put it, I suppose, fairly bluntly, but I think reasonably, when you are killing people, when you are murdering people, when you are raping women, and when you're killing children, one of the ways you justify that is to create a savage or primitive discourse and narrative of the people that you're murdering. So when we go back into the history books, when we go back into the settler diaries that we used to write some of the first national histories of Australia, the fabrication of First Nations people and the savagery as a component of First Nations people is that original foundational story of a lie that is carried on into the future. So what we understand here is the real damage of that. So when the first, again, national, regional, or even local histories are written from a settler invader context and reaching back into those original sources are completely skewed against telling any form of truth about not only the violence and the forms of land theft that are enacted by settler invaders, but certainly also, again, about the lack of supposed sophistication of the history and story of First Nations people. Megan mentioned in the first presentation today, in that wonderful presentation, she talked about the history wars, and she did talk, I think, quite correctly about that history wars being something that many Aboriginal people watch from the sidelines as this sort of fight. This fight took place. I want to talk about that a little bit because it shows, I think, a problem of history as a discipline. And again, when I'm talking about it as a nationalist framework, as a story about the nation. I was involved briefly in that tussle, and the interesting observation I made was, firstly, is that the populist right, so-called historians and commentators involved in that discussion, they actually didn't value history at all. I think they had no sense that history mattered in a ethical way, in a moral way, in a way of telling truth. They saw history or the past as a political object, as a plaything that they would utilize to win a contemporary argument about really whose country are we on, what has happened in this country, and what is the state of First Nations people, particularly in relationship to land rights and ownership of country. So I felt, firstly, that my brief involvement highlighted the fact that these people didn't care about history, so therefore having an ongoing debate with them was a waste of energy and a waste of time. Secondly, though, the supposed, what we might call the professional historians, and historians in the professions here I'm talking about in universities, sometimes see themselves as the aristocracy of the humanities. And what I found in relationship to this aspect was that those who were arguing against the populists and those who were supposedly defending history did it in a way that was completely lacking in any real contest. Because what they did, they approached it from a level of sophistication. They approached it from a level of almost gentility. And what they didn't realize, or that they didn't understand, was that those who they were opposing, those on the right, weren't interested in, again, defending history as a valid discipline. They were more interested in vandalizing history. So I quickly realized that there was no place for me in that debate, because the debate was completely onerous. And if anything, the only way to tackle the right in regard to the history would be able to walk away from them, or literally to get in the gutter with them and have a real fight, one that was as dirty as they were. The other issue I think that is relative here to bring up is that one of the issues that was so central to the so-called history wars was that just preceding or around that time, the Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Bringing Them Home report had come out. And as people may remember, that over 300 witnesses, First Nations people who had been removed from their family, had in fact given evidence to that inquiry. And I find the outcome of that still very disturbing, because here we had an instance where First Nations people, Aboriginal people who had been taken from their families of children, people who had suffered terrible abuses while in incarceration, people who had suffered sexual and physical violence, some people who never got to see their families again, took the courage, had the bravery to retell and relive those traumas before the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission. And at the outcome of that, those same people were denigrated again by right-wing commentators in the media. And it was as if what they had said, their voice, their story, their truth-telling had no validation. That to me was particularly disturbing, because I knew people personally who had bravely relived those traumas and had suffered again because of that. And one of the things that I'd written about while working as a historian was that this was not the memory of Aboriginal people only that was being damaged. It was the memory of colonial violence that was being ignored and being suppressed. And one of the issues that I raised at this time was that white Australia needed to take responsibility for its memory of violence, its memory of colonial violence, and own up to it and talk about it. Because until that was done, Aboriginal people have to carry not only the memory of what has happened to our people, our communities, but has to carry the memory of their oppressor as well. And that's a shocking indictment of the lie of colonial history. So a couple of things I'd want to say in closing is that I did say that I was briefly involved in the history wars debate, and I found it a farce, and I found that I was wasting my time and wasting my energy to have those discussions. It was part of the reason I actually stopped teaching history. So I actually haven't taught history at a university for 18 years now. So I left the history department at the University of Melbourne very, I suppose, distraught about what was happening in regard to this debate. What I did do, and I think what is something we've all got to be aware of, is to think about the idea of generational change. So I was very, I think, optimistic at one level around that time, because I thought that younger people were thinking about the past differently. Younger people were not wedded to this old nationalist story, and younger people were much more questioning, much more critical of this shallow myth of terra nullius. So what I did after that was, in fact, to do some collaborative work with much younger people. And what I found myself personally, rather than bang my head against the wall arguing with people who were so recalcitrant, or people who actually didn't care about truth, they were more interested in a polemic, more interested in a ideology, was to work with young people who were energetic and simply wanted to get on and do something productive, do something collaborative. And one of the things I've found since then, whether I be working as a writer, whether I be working as an activist, or I do a fair bit of work with artists, is that I'm not interested in those old-fashioned adversarial debates. I'm actually interested in doing productive, forward-looking work with people who have a much fresher way of seeing the world. So, and I think it's one of the issues that really, I suppose, saved me for thinking about how do I deal with history in the past, is that I will deal with it in an energetic way. And the final thing that I would say here is it's in relationship to, where do we go from here, other than reconstructing the mammoth. I can't wait to have a mammoth around my place as a pet, thanks to Chris Flynn. But I think there are other issues, and Megan talked really energetically and with great passion about the recognition, the statement from the heart, the Uluru statement from the heart. The thing that I would say about this, and this is not in any way to be critical of people doing such hard work as Megan has done for so often, it's to ask the question, is that does white society, do governments, do national governments, do people have, in fact, the ethical imagination to move forward? Or will people get stuck as people got stuck with the history wars debate? So what we need to do to move forward in relationship to a more honest colonial history and what we might call collective history is to work with people who do have a wonderful term, I think, the ethical imagination to see the country differently, to see the world differently. And if that is possible, I think we can see really positive change in the future. If we continue, though, to come up against people who are recalcitrant and aren't interested in those forward-looking discussions, we're going to chase our tail as we did, I think, a generation ago. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Tony, and thank you all. And I'm going to welcome everybody to the screen now, because if we can get there we go, we got the optics right, thanks to our wonderful producer, Chris Amor. We've got everybody on the screen now. I think those were 5 extraordinary presentations, and we could spend half an hour just unpacking each one alone. But given that we haven't got the time to do that, Tony, I'd like to go straight to you on that last point. And it's a little bit of a where do we go next? What do we do with some of the critical points that each of you have raised about the worth and the efficacy of history? And just reminding you also at home to get your questions up onto the chat screen. So, Tony, in terms of that nationalist story, the big picture, you've suggested that what you're finding is that working locally, working collaboratively, and working with young people in particular is giving you more hope for the future, and certainly more satisfaction in your own professional life. But in terms of that big picture, I mean, one of the things that we're seeing coming out of America so clearly is the fact that people are very willing to live with lies, to swallow lies. They seem to be very comfortable with it. Apparently, Trump has told 18,000 lies, and his popularity remains the same as it was at this stage in the campaign 4 years ago. So, what do you do when people don't want to hear the truth, and they're happy for their elected officials to make facts, or in this case, history, the truth of history, into, as you call it, playthings?
Well, I think there are a couple of things just to start. Is there are people who you'll never convince, and you do have to make a strategic decision about those people who you can engage with and persuade, and that also requires yourself to be open. So you've got to also challenge yourself. That's a really good way to think about engaging in these issues. And there are people who will never want to hear. So I actually don't think you should engage with them at all. Secondly, this might sound like a big claim, but I actually think Donald Trump is an aberration. I think we'll have to judge the Trump era from probably another decade ahead. And I actually do see there's potential for change here. So I'll just park that. I suppose the way I would answer is, as people know, I've been working on climate change and climate justice issues for the last 5 years. And my belief is, how do I work with people who want to do something valuable, productive, and forward-looking? And that statement I made about ethical imagination, I'm actually really, I've been really persuaded by a First Nations scholar on Turtle Island in what people know as Canada, Dwayne Donald, and he's someone who talked about that. And he talks about seeking out those people, seeking out those moments, those forums where you can energize each other as a group of people because of that imagination that you have. And one of the things that Donald says is that we have to actually bypass recalcitrance. So in relationship to colonialism, he believes, say, in Turtle Island, and we think about this globally, there are people on both sides of, and I know it's a bit artificial, but let's call it a fence for argument's sake. There are First Nations people and so-called settler people who do want to do something different, who do want to create something different. And he believes that old-style colonialism that wants those discussions not to take place, we have to bypass those. So initially, I would say, as much as we might feel despondent at times, is that I actually believe all you can do at this moment is to seek out people who you can work productively. And it might seem odd, Claire, to say, well, seek out your own kind. Of course, you've got to persuade people who are not of your kind, but you can't do it in isolation. You can quickly become demoralized if you are working on your own. And I have found that, the climate change area can be really, you can get really despondent. And the way that I deal with that individually is just to find people who are doing great stuff. And in the last 5 years, whether it be Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people working together, whether it be small land care groups, whatever, I have found remarkable people doing remarkable work. And I just stick with that. If I get caught up in the negativity, I'd sort of go and sit in the corner. And once you do that, the game's up. So, people ask me, am I optimistic or pessimistic? And I actually say it doesn't matter what I am. You just keep doing the work.
Megan, in terms of searching out people who you can work with, historians often think of themselves as the good guys, that we're the people who have the ethical imagination, as Tony's put it, and so many of those qualities of anchorage, of ballast, as James has suggested. But what you've suggested in your presentation is that it's the historians, at least the contemporary ones, who have been presumptive and preemptive about the sort of stories that need to be told and how to tell them, and that we're actually not very good listeners. So I'm wondering, how can historians be good allies to the referendum movement?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because I think some have been presumptive, but most have been silent. And I think a lot of our mob have been really fascinated in that post 3 years after Uluru, particularly when you saw Aboriginal communities and First Nations rewriting the history of Australia in the Uluru Statement. So it's not just the first page, it's a very lengthy 18-page document that includes that rewritten history. And, I've been to a lot of Australian kind of historical conferences where there's just silence on it. It's radio silence. And I find that interesting. because and then sometimes I think it's the same in the law, right? Because lawyers like to see themselves as objective and standing outside of the political system. But you never get law reform, right, until you actually get into the political system. You can't get change without becoming political in that sense. And where the historians just kind of put their hands up and go, well, we're just objective, assessors of history and what's going on. When I think, I think it was a pretty scathing indictment by all of the First Nations people, from really old countrymen to young people, about the way in which historians have written the story of Australia. And I just also want to acknowledge, I had read some of Tony's work when I was at school during the history wars. He was one of our Aboriginal kind of historians who contributed to that. But it's I think that there's a challenge there from First Nations people to our historians about what role they will play. And they are playing, right?
And so have you got suggestions for practical ways in which historians can walk side by side with First Nations people?
Look, I think we always say, read the Uluru Statement, read the history, take a look at what our people have to say or had to say. I think I'm a bit like Tony. One of the important things of the Uluru Statement is it's been so localized. Australian retail politics has done us really poorly, and I'm the same with Tony when it comes to law reform. Like, just that kind of performative adversarial set piece. It's our mob will always lose out in that contest, particularly in a kind of utilitarian liberal democracy like ours. Our issues aren't enough to sway any ballot box. And that's partly what the Uluru Statement sets out, is a kind of emotional, ethical argument to the Australian people as to why, we don't want their guilt and we don't want their empathy. We just want them to vote yes at this referendum. It's a functional reform. We're not asking to hand over the entire wheels of the country to us and then unlock something on the other side. Now, what that looks like on the other side after such a substantive kind of change to the Constitution is up to all Australians in terms of their imagination. What does it unlock then in terms of, becoming a part of this country upon which many Australians are born and arrive and live? What is it to live on our country and be so disconnected to our people and our ancestors and our culture? And that is why people call the Uluru Statement a gift. Like, it's a super generous gift, because if you go through those history books that have been written, it's a brutal, brutal history. And so I think, one of the things, I'll just end on this, Claire, was listening to what Tony was saying about imagination. When we went into these dialogues, there was a lot of mob just saying, basically, piss off. You guys always come to us with your ticket box consultations. What do you want now? You go away, you never come back. We're tired of this. And we said to them, and we did the history piece. So we talked about Australian history for the entire day. And then we got to a point where people felt kind of like they'd been heard. And we said, look, law reform is an exercise in imagination. You've got to suspend your disbelief that this nation cannot change. You've got to imagine that Australia can be a better place. And you've got to imagine that Australians are going to come with you on that. And, our people have got every right to be angry at the situation they're in. But, they rolled up their sleeves and they were like, okay, we'll do it then. And I mean, that's such a generous thing for them to have done. And then as I said, over the next 3 days, they produced this incredible reform that not a single Australian constitutional lawyer, black or white, had come up with to a really complex constitutional problem that our people face. And so I just wanted to touch upon that, because it traverses both history and literature, but the notion of this imagination. And there's a lot of that wrapped up in the Uluru Statement. It's not a conventional invitation whatsoever to the Australian people, but it is an invitation to the Australian people. we're asking them to accept that invitation. And how they accept that is up to them. But the one thing we need is for them to vote yes at this referendum. And historians are Australians, right? They need to say yes to the invitation as well.
Jamie, I want to move to you there as an historian. Megan's thrown down the gauntlet, both for historians to listen more closely, but also be more politically engaged, to be more politically active, to step up. Now, you've made a really strong case tonight for the idea of historians as mediators, almost as kind of priests of the archive. The way that you spoke was in very spiritual, almost kind of religious overtones, and that it certainly resonated with me. But I wonder how the history profession justifies itself in a political culture that wants to produce jobs-ready graduates and also doesn't believe in the value of the humanities and pursuits like history. And we're certainly seeing that there are massive drop-offs in the study of history, particularly in high schools. I mean, there are only a very few high schools who teach history at VCE or at the upper levels now. So as an historian there in the university, what do you see the future of the history profession as being?
What a huge question. I think I feel the challenge, and I felt it all the way through your presentation, Megan, and the other presentations tonight. We do feel the gauntlet thrown down, and we have felt it for some time, I think. I'd like to hope that the historians that I'm familiar with would all vote yes and are all keen. It's a question, I think, for us about to what extent we put aside our books and our studies and our writing and engage politically. And I think for my own part, I feel just really disaffected politically, that I don't think we can, I don't see positive change happening. I think I've seen, as you I'm sure have, seen moments of opportunity and then seen each one pass. And I mean, I did see historians sticking up and saying, yes, this is exactly the statement that we need. This is exactly what we want to do. Maybe not enough. Maybe we didn't try enough. As for the historical profession, I mean, look, my contract ends at the end of this year. This is the ECR world that we're in, and it is a dire state. I mean, the morale is low in our departments. We feel that young people don't necessarily see history as a way of knowing the world. They don't see it as a place of imagination. They don't see it as a place of ethics, perhaps. I feel like it's all those things, and I want to keep teaching and writing, and I hope contribute in a positive way with my words and with my study. I do kind of repent or recant from those religious overtones in that sense. I don't see myself as a priest in between people. It's more about bringing alive and bringing in that spiritual thing that we have. And I'm going to be quiet because Tony's got his hand up.
No, Tony, you wanted to respond there?
No, if you've got questions for Lucy and Chris, I'd rather come in after that.
I do, but did you want to say something back to Jamie then?
Well, not back to Jamie. Drink your water, Jamie. No, not back to Jamie. I think that one of the things is I was a history graduate and I met some great historians and great people. I still know them. They write great political history. So, but the issue about a nationalist history and the colonial history is a little different in that I think people need to remember during the so-called history wars debate, the main argument from Aboriginal people I knew wasn't with the right, it was with the so-called left, this liberal left aristocracy who felt that they could speak on our behalf, who actually locked us out of the debate purposefully and then wanted to control the debate. And what we found is, one, is that we didn't really have a voice in that discussion, and two, is they completely misrepresented us, let alone themselves. So when I talk about some of these nationalist historians seeing themselves as the aristocracy of the humanities, I say that with conviction. And I actually think they're highly political. It's about the politics of power in the university sector. And as people know, I was at Melbourne University and we fought for decades for change in that university, and some has come, but some has not come. You've still got a Department of History at the University of Melbourne that does not teach Indigenous history and does not have an Aboriginal person teaching history in 2020. So that's indicative of a political decision, which is about white power. And if you confront people with that reality, they get so upset because they say, we have been your friends, Tony. We're the ones who are fighting for Aboriginal people. Why are you turning on us? What we're saying is get out of the way, and they will not budge. And they will not give, and as Megan said earlier, we shouldn't have a seat at that table in the, I don't know, what's it called? What room is it called, Claire, up there? They have.
I don't know. I got out of there as well, Tony, as you well know.
So I find that to be a highly political act, not an act of intellectual sophistication.
I'm going to stick with the institution for a moment before going to Lucy and Chris, because I want to wrap some of the questions that are coming from the audience into this discussion. I think it's the best way of doing it because there's a perfect one here. Susie Radford asks, isn't it incredibly important to get more of our First Nations people into university history departments as students and as educators? So this is how you get a seat at the table. How does this happen? How I'm opening this to anybody. How do we get more First Nations people into universities studying history? James? Tony?
Well, I just wanted to say that I really like the question. I mean, that has to happen because it answers or addresses what I just said, my complaint. The other thing that came out of the history wars is, and I think Megan would attest to this, is that a lot of First Nations people saw that the debate as a farce and irrelevant, but it doesn't mean that we don't have people engaging critically with history. A lot of young First Nations people do it through art, do it through film, do it through literature. So we're always engaging with history in a critical way. But so what I suppose would say to the question is, we don't have to all be at that table. There are other ways in which we can frame discussions of the past. So I think it'd be more to say, how can we get more First Nations voices in public culture rather than necessarily all doing, if they're all doing history, geez, God forbid, it'd be a terrible situation for all of us.
So, Lucy, you have taken up this point that Tony said, is that there are many different ways to do history, and you framed history as a conversation starter. And I like your idea of it as being a Trojan horse, or Kate Grenville's that you've taken up. And I'm interested to know how the conversation around Salt Creek, or the conversations you started with that novel, have progressed since 2015. Enough time has elapsed. I'm interested because I know that academics now, we're expected to demonstrate what's called the impact of our work. Do you have a sense of the impact of that novel?
Yeah, I think that kind of sense is derived partly from those conversations that I mentioned that I have at festivals and at talks and so on. But it also happens quite a bit online, that people will get in touch, or people will contact me with, kind of extensive family histories and their speculations about what might have been going on. So instead of this idea of them just receiving the stories that they've always heard, they're now wondering about them themselves. And whether that's because of Salt Creek or because of a series of novels that have similarly speculated about what might have been going on, I don't know exactly. Sometimes they say it's about Salt Creek, but I have this kind of further. I mean, I don't really. I'm uncomfortable with the idea of fiction being used as a tool to educate, even though I think that is what happens quite often. But I do have this sense of this kind of ongoing conversation happening in South Australia, which I guess I know more of the history of, and of this kind of tussle, I guess, or a kind of, I wouldn't call it a war, but this great resistance to seeing South Australia as not the most pure of the so-called colonies. It is something that really... It just is very, very impervious to change, and it kind of comes up a lot there. And they're terribly protective of their attachment to that province and its kind of purer, as they see it, origins. Yeah, so I think, these things like Salt Creek that they feel a kind of sense of ownership of is like, I guess that is that Trojan horse. They're keen to read something about themselves, but they're also not very thrilled about the idea of their complicity in a whole lot of really dreadful murderous confrontations and destruction of lands, livelihoods, or seeing the kind of ongoing strength of cultures like the Ngarrindjeri culture, which has been maintained despite everyone's efforts to destroy it. So I think it is not well recognised in South Australia. I would love it to be.
Yeah, well, certainly conceding power is a difficult thing, but also conceding a control over the story itself when the story is now out of control, when you've changed the narrative. Chris, to this issue of power in a way, I think we're all going to go away from this session with the idea that the mammoth is coming back. But I wonder, beyond the mammoth, what else comes back? And more importantly, who gets to choose what comes back? Is it going to be the scientists, the politicians, the business people? Will the Rio Tinto executives be choosing what to bring back because they can pay for it? And do the historians get any say?
For me, history is a constant struggle between power and imagination. And it speaks to this idea of colonialism. The mammoth bones are like all dinosaur bones and the bones of megafauna, and sometimes the bones of people. They are there's a real colonialism attached to that. I mean, the British Museum, for example, I know there's been a lot of issues over that. For hundreds of years now, with their ownership of Indigenous remains, and a lot of people here in Australia trying to get those back. And it seems to me that this idea of power is very much tied in, like the power to control history is very much tied into the colonial project, which still seems to endure. I have a very strong sense, growing up in Northern Ireland, a very strong sense of being colonized. And I've never been able, and then I thought, I'll move to Australia, I won't feel it there, but you feel it exactly the same thing here again. But I love the idea of us breaking out of that idea of breaking away from the colonial project, shrugging it off by using our imagination, by looking at history, reading books like James's and thinking about history in a different way to help us forge a new sort of historical future for ourselves. And one of the things about writing a book like Mammoth is that it sparked my imagination, the story, and it made me think about history in a very different way and think about who controls the story of history, both for us lowly humans and for the creatures that we shared the earth with. So I'm an optimist. I hope that we can learn from the lessons of history, and I'm just kind of waiting for all the bloody colonialists to die off so we can get on with our lives.
So we.
Yeah, well, I think even the post-colonialists are dying off in the institutions now, so we're maybe we can start getting the work done on the ground. Look, obviously we could continue this conversation long into the night, but unbelievably our time has come to an end. I hope that what everybody's presentations have done for the audience tonight is to answer that question, history, what is it good for, with the opposite to what the line that Chris sang earlier. I think the what we should respond to that call is absolutely everything. Say it again. And maybe Kristen Krauth in the audience there with your question for your daughter, what is the point of doing history? Maybe that is the point. It is about everything that we've heard today, about imagination, about empathy, about ballast, about politics, about power, and about making a change, and remembering that at the end of every policy there is a person, and at the heart of every story there is a person as well. So just in concluding, I'd like to thank Megan, Tony, Lucy, Chris, and Jamie. It feels like the Brady Bunch here. Thank you all for coming along and being part of the history family tonight. Thank you to the organisers of this event, particularly the Right Around the Murray director, Anne-Marie Ellis, and to our digital producer, Chris Amor. And thank you to you, the audience, for being with us tonight. This is a writers' festival, and I want to encourage you to purchase the festival guests' books. One way to do that is you can place an order with Dymocks Albury, who will deliver free to the Albury residents, and a discounted fee to other people around Australia. But another way is to Google up your local independent bookstore and to order the titles of these books. James's Bedlam at Botany Bay, Chris's Mammoth, Lucy Treloar's Wolf Creek, Tony Birch's The White Girl are the latest ones out. Megan has a book on the horizon that you are going to want to get your hands on very quickly. The publishing industry and the bookselling industry in Australia is also in crisis at this difficult time. So please support these authors and please support this industry. You can go to rightaroundthemurray.org.au for details to find out what's next in the festival. It's all free, and to complete an online survey to go into the draw to win a 6-pack of festival titles and what has been described as a dashing Right Around the Murray tote bag. And I think we'd all like to step out in one of those dashing bags. Be safe, everybody. Hang in there, Melbourne, and we'll see you next time. Bye.